Content warning. This content may be unsuitable for viewers under 18 years of age and those who are sensitive to fear, horror, or disturbing themes. If you are under 18 or sensitive to frightening content, please do not watch. The night that changed everything. You know that feeling on Christmas Eve, the one where the whole world seems to slow down, go quiet, and wrap itself in something warm and golden. The smell of pine needles and cinnamon, the soft glow of string lights blurring through a frosted window, the sound of a Christmas movie playing low in the background while snow piles up silently outside. Now imagine that feeling, that exact, perfect, cozy feeling, and imagine it shattered. Not slowly, not gently, but all at once, like a mirror dropped on a tile floor. The pieces flying so fast you can't even track where they land. That's what happened to the Calloway family in the winter of 2003. And nobody who lived through it has ever looked at Christmas the same way again. The Calloways weren't the kind of family you'd expect to end up in a story like this. They were ordinary in the best possible way. Dad, Thomas, coached Little League in the spring and spent his autumn weekends raking leaves and grilling burgers. Mom, Sandra, taught third grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from their house in a small Ohio town called Millhaven. They had 3 kids, 16-year-old Marcus, 12-year-old Lily, and 6-year-old Danny, who had just lost his 2 front teeth and was absolutely convinced that this year was the year Santa would finally bring him the remote-controlled truck he'd been asking for since he was 4. The house itself was the kind of place that looks like it belongs on a Christmas card. White clapboard siding, a big covered porch, a wreath on the front door that Sandra made herself every year from branches she cut from the pine trees in the backyard. Thomas always complained, mildly and lovingly, that she went overboard with the decorations. Inside, every surface held something festive. Nutcrackers lined the mantel. A ceramic village glowed softly on the bookshelf, and the Christmas tree in the living room stood nearly 7 feet tall, crowded with 20 years' worth of ornaments, each one carrying a memory. It was, by every measure, a home built for the holidays. And that's exactly what made what happened so deeply, irreversibly wrong. It started on December the 23rd, 2 nights before Christmas. Marcus had gone to bed early, unusual for a teenager, but he'd been feeling off all day. Headache, a little nauseous, the kind of vague unwellness that doesn't quite qualify as sick, but doesn't feel like nothing either. Sandra had checked his temperature twice, normal both times. She told him to drink water, get some sleep, and that he'd probably feel better in the morning. Lily was still awake past 11, technically, though she was in bed with her lamp on reading a book. She was always the last one to fall asleep. Even as a little kid, she'd had this restlessness, this sense that something interesting might happen the moment she closed her eyes, and she didn't want to miss it. Danny was out cold by 8:30. He'd worn himself out helping his dad hang the last of the outdoor lights, and he'd fallen asleep on the couch still clutching a candy cane, which Sandra carefully extracted from his fingers before carrying him up to bed. Thomas stayed up later than he meant to. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of eggnog and his laptop, doing that thing he always did in the weeks before Christmas, going back through old photos, falling into memories. The kids when they were small, Christmases past, his own parents gone now, standing in front of a tree in a house that no longer belonged to anyone in the family. He sat there alone in that quiet kitchen and he felt grateful. Fully, genuinely grateful. The way you can only feel it when the house is still and the people you love are close, and everything feels, at least for a moment, like enough. He went to bed just after midnight. The sound started at 2:47 a.m., Sandra heard it first. She was a light sleeper, always had been, the occupational hazard of being a mother. And even in deep sleep, some part of her brain was always listening. The sound pulled her up through the layers of sleep like a hook catching on cloth. She lay still for a moment, eyes open in the dark. Thump, slow, deliberate. Something moving across the floor above them. The attic. Thomas was still asleep, his breathing deep and even beside her. Sandra sat up listening. The house was quiet. Maybe she'd imagined it. Thump, thump. She hadn't imagined it. She reached over and shook Thomas's shoulder. He surfaced slowly, groggy, already forming the words, "What's wrong?" before he was even fully conscious. "Something's in the attic," Sandra whispered. He sat up, listened. Silence. He looked at her the way tired husbands look at tired wives in the middle of the night. Not dismissive, not quite, but wearing that expression that says it's probably nothing. Can we please go back to sleep? But Sandra was already out of bed. She had that feeling. Mothers know that feeling. The one that doesn't explain itself, doesn't wait to be justified by logic, doesn't care that it's 2:47 in the morning and the most likely explanation is a raccoon or a loose shutter or the house settling in the cold. The feeling that said, something is wrong in this house. She was right. What she found at the top of the attic stairs was something she would spend years trying to describe and never quite manage. Not because it was so visually shocking, it wasn't, not at first, but because of the wrongness of it, the way it didn't fit, the way her brain kept trying to find a normal explanation and kept failing. The attic was lit, faintly, palely, by a string of Christmas lights Thomas had installed up there 2 years ago to make it easier to find boxes. In that pale glow, surrounded by stacked holiday bins and forgotten furniture, sitting with its back to her in a rocking chair that had belonged to Sandra's grandmother. Something was there. Thomas came up behind her a moment later and stopped so suddenly he nearly knocked her forward. They stood together at the top of the stairs, neither of them speaking, the cold of the unheated attic pressing in around them. It was wearing a coat, an old one, dark red, almost burgundy, with a hood pulled up and forward so that from behind you couldn't see a face at all. Just the back of a hood and the arms of the coat resting on the arms of the chair. Still. Completely, unnervingly still. It was not moving, but it was rocking. The chair was rocking slowly, steadily, back and forth, as if pushed by the gentlest of hands. But nothing was touching it. Nothing they could see. Thomas found his voice first. He called out, a greeting, a question, some combination of hello and who are you and what are you doing in my house that came out less coherently than he intended. His voice shook. He would tell you later that he was not proud of how his voice shook, but he'd also tell you that you had to be there. The figure did not respond. It did not move. It rocked. Thomas took a step forward and Sandra grabbed his arm. Later, she couldn't explain why. She just knew, the same way she'd known something was wrong, that he should not go closer. That whatever was sitting in that chair, the rules about approaching it were different from the rules about approaching anything else she had ever encountered in her life. Thomas, she whispered, just his name. But he heard everything in it. He stopped. They stood there for what felt like minutes, though it was probably 30 seconds. The chair rocked. The Christmas lights cast their pale glow. The cold pressed in. And then, slowly the way nightmares move, with that horrible deliberateness that means you can see it coming, and you still can't stop it. The figure in the chair turned its head. Sandra would later describe the face as wrong in a way I can't explain to you, and I've given up trying. Thomas would describe it as nothing I want to describe. Marcus, when he heard the story the next morning, would press them for details and eventually stop pressing when he saw his mother's expression. They ran. Down the attic stairs, across the landing, into the master bedroom with the door locked behind them. Thomas grabbed his phone and called 911. Sandra stood with her back to the door, her hands pressed flat against the wood, listening for footsteps. The police came in 11 minutes. They found nothing in the attic. The rocking chair, the one that had belonged to Sandra's grandmother, was exactly where it had always been. Still. Empty. Cold. There was no sign that anyone had been there. Except for one thing. On the seat of the chair, placed with a precision that felt intentional, felt deliberate, was a single ornament. A glass ball, hand-painted, the kind that costs maybe $3 at any craft store in America. But this one was painted in a way that made the responding officer, a 20-year veteran named Carl Briggs, take a photograph of it before touching it. On the ornament, in paint so fine it must have been done with a single hairbrush, was a scene. A house. White clapboard siding. A covered porch. A wreath on the front door. The Calloway house. Painted in perfect detail. And in every window of the painted house, in every single window, all 8 of them visible from the front, there was a small, dark figure, standing, watching, looking out. What Christmas hides. The Calloways didn't leave. That's the first thing people always say when they hear this story. Why didn't they leave? And the answer is the same answer it always is in situations like this. The answer that sounds crazy from the outside, but makes complete sense when you're in it. Because it was Christmas Eve morning, and they had 3 children who believed in magic. And somewhere in the gap between something terrifying happened last night, and our kids are going to wake up in 2 hours expecting the most wonderful morning of the year. They found a way to decide that leaving would make it worse. Also, and this is important, the police found nothing. No evidence of a break-in. No footprints in the snow outside the attic window. No fingerprints on the ornament. Nothing. Carl Briggs had been gentle with them. Thorough, professional. He'd walked every inch of that attic. He'd checked every window and every vent. He'd looked at the ornament under a flashlight and then carefully placed it in an evidence bag. Before he left, he'd given Thomas his direct number and said, with an honesty that Thomas appreciated, "I don't have an explanation for you right now, but I don't see a current threat. I want you to call me if anything else happens." So they stayed. Sandra made coffee at 4 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table with Thomas, and they talked in low voices for 2 hours. They talked through every rational explanation. Sleepwalking, stress-induced hallucination, an elaborate prank by someone who knew the house. Thomas's brother had a dark sense of humor and had been over for Thanksgiving. Could he have? No. No, they kept coming back to no. Because the ornament was real. The ornament was in an evidence bag on its way to a police lab. And neither of them, separately and without discussing it, had described the same thing to Officer Briggs in the same detail. If they'd both been imagining it, they'd both seen it. They'd both seen the face. At 6 a.m., Danny came downstairs in his footy pajamas and wanted to know if Santa had come. Thomas lifted him up and carried him to the tree, and they looked together at the pile of presents underneath it. And when Danny saw the shape of a large box near the back, the right size for a remote-controlled truck, he made a sound that Thomas would describe in the years that followed as the sound that made me decide Christmas was going to happen normally if I had to personally fight whatever was in that attic to make it so. Marcus came down at 7, still pale, feeling somewhat better. Lily appeared at 7:30 with her book, already reading, already in her own world. Sandra made pancakes. Thomas kept glancing at the ceiling. It was a perfectly normal Christmas Eve morning, beautiful even. The snow had kept falling overnight and the yard was pristine and white, and the icicles along the porch roof caught the early sun and threw it in fragments across the kitchen wall. Danny kept running to the window. Lily read. Marcus slowly started to seem like himself again, and Sandra and Thomas moved through all of it with the particular, careful brightness of parents who are holding something frightening at a careful distance from their children. The second incident happened at noon. Lily found it. She'd gone upstairs to get a different book. She'd finished the first one. She always finished faster than seemed possible. And she came back down the stairs with the careful, controlled expression of someone who has been frightened and is trying not to show it. "Mom," she said, "can you come look at something?" In Lily's room, on her windowsill, the windowsill where she kept a row of small glass animals she'd been collecting since she was 8, someone had rearranged the animals. They'd been placed in a circle facing inward, around a space in the center of the windowsill where something had rested. The dust had been disturbed in a circular pattern, as if an object had sat there and been removed. Lily hadn't moved them. None of them had been in Lily's room. Sandra stood at the windowsill for a long moment, looking at the small glass rabbit and the glass deer and the glass fox, all arranged with an intention she couldn't explain, all facing that empty center, and she felt the cold again. That same attic cold, pressing in despite the warmth of the room, the sunlight through the glass, the sound of Thomas and the kids laughing downstairs. She called Officer Briggs. He came back. He took photographs. He found no evidence of entry through the window. It was locked from the inside, which meant either it had been locked after whoever did this had left, or they had never come through the window at all. He checked the room carefully. He found nothing else. Before he left, standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his hat in his hands, he looked at Sandra in a way that made her stomach drop. "Mrs. Calloway," he said quietly, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Is there anyone at all, who might want to frighten your family? An estranged relative? A neighbor dispute? Anyone you've had conflict with?" Sandra thought about it carefully the way he asked, and she said no. Genuinely, confidently no. They were the kind of family who didn't collect enemies. Thomas coached Little League. He was universally liked. Sandra's most contentious relationship at school was with the copier machine. They lived in Mill Haven for 11 years, and they knew everyone on their street. Officer Briggs nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I've got someone I'd like to have look at that ornament. I'll be in touch." He left. Christmas Eve passed in a state of strange suspension. The decorations were beautiful, and the kids made Christmas cookies, and Marcus taught Danny a card game, and it should have been, in every visible way, a perfect holiday afternoon. But Sandra kept watching the windows. Thomas kept glancing at the ceiling, and when the sun went down at 5 p.m., and the yard went dark and the shadows gathered under the pine trees at the edge of the property, both of them felt it. That pressing, inexplicable sense that something outside was watching the house, the way the figures in the painted ornament had watched, present and patient and waiting. Dinner was Sandra's grandmother's pot roast, the same meal they had every Christmas Eve, a tradition so embedded in the family it felt like law. Danny ate 3 rolls and fell asleep on the couch again, which was also tradition. Marcus and Lily helped clear the table, which was less tradition and more a sign that they were both, on some level, picking up on the mood in the house and were doing what teenagers sometimes do when they sense their parents are scared. They became quietly helpful. At 10 p.m., Thomas put Danny to bed for the second time that day. He sat on the edge of the little bed in the little room with the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, and he read Danny the same book he'd read him every Christmas Eve since he could understand words. A story about a boy on a train to the North Pole. Danny was asleep before the train arrived. Thomas sat in the dark of his son's room for a few extra minutes. He listened to the small, steady sound of Danny breathing. He looked at the glow-in-the-dark stars above the bed. He thought about the ornament and the rocking chair and the face he'd seen and would not describe. And he made himself a promise, the way fathers make promises in the dark of their children's rooms, wordlessly, without ceremony, but absolutely, that whatever was happening, whatever this was, his family was going to be okay. He went back downstairs. At 11:15, every light in the house went out. Darkness at 11:15. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming. All at once, the kitchen lights, the living room lamps, the string lights on the tree, the night light in the upstairs hallway that had been on every single night since Danny was born. All of it gone, simultaneously between one moment and the next. The house went dark as if a hand had covered it. Thomas had been in the kitchen. Sandra had been in the living room, checking the presents under the tree. One more time, adjusting ribbons, doing that last-minute thing parents do when they want everything to be perfect in the morning. The sudden darkness hit them both like something physical, a pressure, a disorientation, a lurch of the stomach that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with what had already happened in that house over the past 9 hours. Thomas. Sandra's voice from the living room, controlled, careful. I'm here. He was already moving toward her voice, hands out in the dark, navigating the kitchen he'd walked through 1,000 times. The tree lights are out too. I know. That's not the same circuit. He knew that too. The house had been rewired 3 years ago. Thomas had overseen the whole project, the way detail-oriented men do, learning more about circuit breakers and load capacity than he'd ever needed to know and then retaining all of it. The kitchen and living room were on different circuits. The outdoor lights were on a third. The tree was plugged into an outlet that ran on yet a fourth. For all of them to go simultaneously, it wasn't a tripped breaker. It wasn't even a local outage. He could see through the living room window the glow of his neighbor Phil's porch light 50 yards away. Steady and indifferent. Whatever had killed the power in the Calloway house had been selective. Thomas found Sandra in the dark. They stood together in the living room, whispering, the way people whisper when they're afraid and don't want whatever they're afraid of to hear them. Thomas had his phone out, flashlight on. The pale beam moved across the familiar room, the ceramic village, the nutcrackers on the mantel, the enormous tree standing dark and still in the corner, its ornaments catching the flashlight beam and throwing it back in small, scattered points of light. Something about the tree stopped him. He moved the flashlight slowly, carefully, back over the tree, running it up from the base to the star at the top. The star, a white metal star Sandra's mother had given them on their first married Christmas, was in place. The ornaments were all in place. The branches were still and full and wrong. The ornaments were wrong. He took a step closer. Sandra came with him, her hand tight on his arm, the flashlight beam steady on the tree. The ornaments had been moved. Not all of them. The old ones, the handmade ones, the ones with the kids' school pictures and the salt dough handprints from when they were small. Those were still in their usual places. But the plain balls, The solid colors, the ones without personal meaning, those had been rearranged. They were clustered on one side of the tree. All of them, every single plain ornament, gathered together on the left side of the tree in a dense mass. And on the right side, where they had been, the branches were bare, stripped clean. In the spaces left by the missing ornaments, something had been placed instead. Small pieces of paper, folded into triangles the way you fold a note in middle school, hanging from the branches by loops of red thread. There were 7 of them. Thomas counted. He counted twice. 7. Sandra was the one who reached out and unfolded the first one. Her hands were shaking. She'd tell you they were shaking. She's not a woman who pretends bravery she doesn't have. But she unfolded it anyway and held it in the flashlight beam and read it. It said, "I have been watching your family for a very long time." The second one said, "You have a beautiful home." The third, "The boy in the blue room talks in his sleep." The fourth, "The girl with the books knows more than she says." The fifth, "The older boy saw me on the stairs in October. He thought it was a dream." The sixth, "You redecorated the attic in June. The new shelves are very organized." The seventh, and Thomas would later say this was the one that broke something open in his chest. The 7th note, folded smallest of all, hanging on the lowest branch, said, "Merry Christmas. I will see you next year." Sandra called Officer Briggs before she'd even finished reading the last note. While they waited, Thomas went upstairs. He checked every room. Lily was asleep, or appeared to be, curled tight on her side, her book on the pillow next to her, her lamp off for once. Danny was asleep, the glow-in-the-dark stars above him pulsing faintly in the dark. Marcus's door was closed and there was no light under it. Thomas stood in the hallway and listened to the house. The silence of a house at midnight on Christmas Eve, that silence that's supposed to be magical, that he'd stood in before in other years with a kind of reverence, was different now. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of something waiting. He went back downstairs. Officer Briggs arrived in under 10 minutes this time. He brought a second officer. They went through the house systematically, thoroughly, with flashlights and gloved hands. They found nothing. No one. No sign of entry. No explanation for the power outage that every utility check would later confirm had affected only the Calloway house for 47 minutes, and no other home on the street or in the surrounding grid. The notes went into evidence bags, all 7 of them. Briggs stood in the living room with Thomas and Sandra and looked at the tree, the clustered ornaments on one side, the bare branches on the other, the empty loops of red thread where the notes had been. And he was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said finally. "I've been doing this for 20 years, and I don't have an explanation for what's happening in this house. I don't say that to scare you. I say it because you deserve honesty." He paused. "I think you should consider leaving tonight." "It's Christmas," Sandra said. "I know. Our kids are asleep." "I know that too." There was a silence. Then Thomas said, "Is there something you're not telling us?" Briggs was quiet for a moment that lasted just a beat too long. Then he said, "There's a house 3 miles from here. Different family. They moved out in 2001. I can't discuss the specifics, but I'll tell you that some of what you're describing tonight is not entirely new to me." He stopped. "Stay together tonight. All in one room if you're comfortable with that. Keep your phones charged. Call me for anything." He left. Thomas and Sandra sat in the living room in the dark. The power didn't come back on until almost 1 a.m., an event that produced no explanation and no apology from the power company, because the power company had no record of any outage at their address. And they made a decision. They were not going to wake the children. They were going to stay. And they were going to sit together in the living room, on the couch, back to back, facing opposite directions. And they were going to be awake when morning came. What Christmas morning brought Christmas morning came the way it always does, without announcement, without ceremony. The darkness simply becoming less dark and then gray, and then the particular cold, clear light of a December morning after snow. Danny came downstairs at 6:02 a.m. and screamed with delight at the presents. Not fear. Delight. Pure, uncomplicated, 6-year-old Christmas morning delight that cut through everything that had happened in that house over the past 12 hours like a beam of actual sunlight. Thomas and Sandra, sitting on the couch with their eyes gritty and their bodies stiff, watched their youngest son run to the tree. And Sandra started crying, quietly into Thomas's shoulder, not from sadness, from the specific relief of seeing something beautiful happen in a place where you'd been afraid, from the particular gratitude of morning came, and we're all here. Lily came down next, took one look at her parents' faces, and went to the kitchen to make coffee without being asked. She was 12 years old. She made the coffee strong and she brought it to them without comment. She had always been perceptive, always seen more than she said. The note on the tree had been right about that, which was somehow the most frightening thing about the notes, the specific rightness of them, the proof of an intimate observation. Thomas pushed that thought away. Not right now. The kids were here. It was Christmas morning. Marcus appeared at 7, more himself than he'd been in 2 days. The strange illness apparently resolved overnight. He sat on the floor and helped Danny tear open the remote-controlled truck box, and the truck itself was everything Danny had hoped it would be, and possibly more. And the noise of it careening around the hardwood floor of the living room was exactly the right kind of chaos for that moment. By 10 a.m., the wrapping paper was everywhere, and the tree was surrounded by open boxes, and there was a smell of coffee, and the cinnamon rolls Sandra had put in the oven on auto timer the night before. And if you had walked in off the street, you would have seen a family having a perfect Christmas morning. But here is the thing about what happened in the Calloway house that December. Here is the thing that makes this story not just a story about a scary Christmas. There are plenty of those. But a story about something more persistent, more patient, more deeply unsettling than a single night of fear. It didn't stop. Not that year. Not the next. In December of 2004, Sandra found an ornament on the front porch on the morning of December 22nd. A glass ball, hand-painted. A different house this time, one she didn't recognize, with figures in the windows. She called Officer Briggs. He drove over, looked at it, and was quieter than she'd ever seen him. "Did you have anyone, any service people, contractors, anyone in and around the house since last Christmas?" he asked. She'd had a plumber in February, a painter in September, the furnace inspection in October. He wrote all of it down. In 2005, it was a note in the mailbox, no envelope. Just a folded piece of paper that said, in that same careful handwriting, "The kitchen looks nice with the new paint." Pale yellow was the right choice. They had repainted the kitchen in August. Pale yellow. Sandra had gone back and forth on the color for weeks. In 2006, nothing. Which was almost worse, because the absence of something isn't the same as safety. It's just silence. And silence by then had a different texture in the Calloway house than it had before December 23rd. 2003. Silence had weight. Silence meant listening. Silence meant paying attention to every room, every window, every shadow at the edge of the yard where the pine trees stood in the dark. Thomas had cameras installed after the 2005 note. Good ones, the best he could afford, covering every angle of the exterior of the house. He reviewed the footage compulsively in December of each year. He found nothing. Whatever, whoever, was doing this either knew about the cameras or operated in a way that cameras didn't catch. Either possibility was its own specific brand of terrible. The family began talking about leaving Millhaven. They didn't, for years. The kids were in school. They had a community. Thomas had a job he valued, and Sandra had a classroom of third graders who needed her. You don't pull up 11 years of roots, and then 14, and then 17, easily, even when the roots are tangled around something frightening. But the conversation kept coming back. And then, in December of 2009, Marcus, now 22, living in Columbus, home for the holidays, came downstairs on the morning of December the 24th, with his face a careful blank, and asked his parents if they could talk privately. He told them what the note on the tree had meant, that he'd seen something on the stairs in October of 2003, that he'd told himself it was a dream, had genuinely, successfully convinced himself it was a dream, the way 19-year-old boys convince themselves of things, but that it had never fully gone away, that there was a night in October, coming home late, that he'd passed the staircase to the attic and seen a shape at the top of it. Dark. Still. Not moving. Just there. He'd blinked and it was gone, and he'd gone to bed and decided it was a trick of the light and tiredness and maybe some kind of low-grade fever. The note had said, "The older boy saw me on the stairs in October." He thought it was a dream. He thought it was a dream. He hadn't thought that in 6 years, not fully. He'd thought it was something he'd made himself believe because the alternative was something he couldn't afford to think about when he was 16 and living in that house and sleeping down the hall from whatever had been at the top of those stairs. Sandra cried again. This time not from relief. They left Millhaven the following spring. The house sold quickly. It was a beautiful house, the kind that sells itself. The buyers were a young couple from Cincinnati with a baby on the way, exactly the kind of people who look at a 7-foot ceiling and a covered porch and a pine tree in the backyard and see exactly what the Callaways had seen the day they'd moved in. A home built for the holidays. Sandra almost told them. She stood in the driveway on the day of closing, watching this young couple carry the first boxes through the front door, and she almost turned around and walked back in and told them about the ornament and the notes and the rocking chair and the face and all of it. She almost did. Thomas touched her arm. "Sandra." She looked at him. "We have nothing concrete," he said. "We have things that scared us. We have no evidence of real harm. We can't take their Christmas from them before it's even happened." She looked at the house. Her house. The wreath mount still on. The front door where she'd hung a wreath every year for 17 years. The windows where the figures in the ornament had stood watching, in the painted version, on that first terrible night. She got in the car. They drove away. Every year, Sandra sends a Christmas card to that couple in Millhaven. She has for 15 years. They always send one back. Photos of the kids, updates about the house, the warm, ordinary commerce of holiday correspondence between people who share an address in their histories. The cards are always cheerful. Sandra reads every one of them looking for something. She's never sure what. A sign, a shadow, a sentence that sounds underneath its ordinary words like something else. She hasn't found it yet. She tells herself that's a good thing. Most of the time, She believes it. But here's what stays with her. Here's the thing she can't put down. The thing that's never resolved itself into something she can file away and close. It's not the rocking chair. It's not the face she saw, though that's there too, in the dark of certain nights, complete and unacceptable. It's not even the notes, though the notes were the most concrete evidence that whatever was happening was real and deliberate, and had been happening for longer than Christmas Eve 2003. It's the seventh note. Merry Christmas. I will see you next year. Because whatever it was, person, presence, something she still doesn't have a satisfying word for, it kept that promise. For 6 years, it kept that promise. And then they moved, and maybe it stopped, and maybe it found someone else. And maybe this is the thought that wakes her at 2:47 a.m. in December. The same time she first heard the sound in the attic, the same time it always comes. Maybe it comes back to Mill Haven every December, regardless of who lives in that house. Maybe it has nothing to do with the Callaways at all. Maybe it never did. Maybe it's about the house. And maybe, right now in that white clapboard house with the covered porch and the pine trees in the backyard and the wreath mount on the front door, a family is getting ready for Christmas. Maybe the kids are excited and the parents are tired and happy, and the smell of pine needles and cinnamon is in every room, and the string lights are glowing warm and golden. Maybe everything is fine. Or maybe in the attic, in the pale glow of Christmas lights, strung along the rafters among the stacked holiday bins and the forgotten furniture, a rocking chair is moving, slowly, steadily, as if pushed by the gentlest of hands. And something is sitting in it, waiting, patient as December, patient as the dark. Merry Christmas.